I work with Alberta Agriculture. Now we're Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, so I keep forgetting to say that. We've welcomed forestry to us. I work on managed bees and pollination at the research center. So I want to keep it pretty informal. If you have any questions at all, please just stop me and ask me, because if you don't know, I'm sure other people would want to know the answer too. So don't hesitate to comment or question or say speak up or anything that comes to mind. So when most people think of bees, this is what they think of. They think of the European honeybee. It's an introduced species from Europe, obviously. There's about, depends how you divide them up, but there's between about 6 and 12 species of honeybee, but we only have the one introduced from Europe, and primarily we use this one because it's a temperate evolved species, so it's evolved in a place that has winter. And why this is important is because of the winter period, they need to store lots of food, and so they store lots of honey in their boxes, whereas the tropical species don't do that. So they make honey, but they only have a little bit at a time because there's always something blooming. So it's the European species that's really good for humans to collect honey from because they have to store so much. But we have a huge number of bees in Canada. It's estimated we have about 900 to 1,000 species of bee. Here in Alberta, we probably have about 500. And of all these species, we really only manage 3 for pollination in Alberta. We have the European honeybee species. We have leafcutter bees. Probably most of you know what leafcutter bees are used to pollinate. They're used for alfalfa and canola seed production. We also have bumblebees that you can actually buy a bumblebee colony from a company and use it to pollinate. Primarily they're used in greenhouses for things like cucurbits, so cucumbers or tomatoes, peppers, those kinds of crops. But even here in Lethbridge, we have a lot of different bee species. These are all collected from the area. Many of you probably know the bumblebees, the really big furry ones. Bumblebees are the ones that are social too, like a honeybee, but their colonies are much, much smaller and they nest in the ground. So a bumblebee colony might have between about 20 and 100 workers, whereas at its peak, a honeybee colony might have about 60, 50,000 workers in it. So smaller colonies for the bumblebees, and only the queen overwinters in a bumblebee colony, as opposed to a honeybee colony where all the workers will overwinter. Bumblebee colony, it's just the queens. And so the first bumblebees you see in the spring, those are the queens, and they're really, really big. So the first really big ones, make sure you are nice to them, because without them, the whole nest will founder. We also have Carpenter bees. We have these really shiny, beautiful green ones, Agapistemnon, here in Lethbridge. They nest in the ground in a hole. They don't have any real social life. They just provision a nest and then fly away. They don't interact with one another. But if you come up later, you can see some of the diversity of bees that we have around here, and you might see things like, that doesn't look like a bee, but actually they are. We also have insects that mimic bees. We have hoverflies that look like a bee, but they're not. You can tell by the number of wings. Bees will always have 2 pairs of wings, and flies have 1 big pair of wings. So if it only has 2 wings, it's not a bee. We have a really large and important honeybee industry in Alberta. We have about 43% of the honeybee colonies in Canada are actually in Alberta. So it's a huge, huge industry here, and we're a huge part of the industry nationally. And part of that is actually canola seed production. Bringing that market, that pollination market online, has expanded the industry in southern Alberta in particular. So our colony numbers have actually increased to fill that pollination demand. In Alberta, we also do a lot of honey production. Basically, if you go north of Calgary, that's all bees for honey production. And we get pretty good crops in Alberta. Manitoba and Saskatchewan, sometimes they're larger. They might get as much as, say, 250 pounds of honey per colony in some of those really top honey producing regions. Around here, we might get maybe 80 pounds, something like that. The industry has faced a lot of challenges, the honey beekeeping industry, over the years. If you look at the number of colonies, it's over years since like the early 1900s, it's pretty interesting. You'll see like a real spike around World War II when there was sugar rationing, and then it sort of crashed after that. So it's all demand. I mean, the industry, the number of beekeepers and the number of honeybee colonies follows the demand for honey and for pollination services. During the war, they also used wax in some of the industrial processes, so there's a demand for the honey and the wax. Number of colonies in Canada is about 600,000 to 700,000, and it's slowly increasing. There's a big demand out east right now for honeybees to pollinate blueberries, so that market is growing. But the industry's faced a few significant challenges in the last few decades. One was the introduction of this parasite. It's a mite. If I were the size of the bee, it'd be about like this big on my body, and it basically sucks the blood, so there's these little vampires running around. Imagine a vampire this big on you. It's pretty horrific thing, and colonies can die from it untreated. They'll die very, very quickly. They don't last around here. So this is why one of the reasons why we don't really have wild honeybees around here. They don't tend to survive for more than a couple of years if there's a feral colony. Sometimes you'll find them in buildings or whatever. So besides this mite, what happened was, besides the mite itself being a problem, it also creates import and export issues because all of a sudden we have a parasite. So that closed the border with the US. So we used to get packages of bees from the US, and the beekeepers here would start these packages in the spring, grow their honeybee colonies that way. Now we can't get packages from the US, only queens, so we have to import packages from Australia and New Zealand. And as you can imagine, shipping bees from Australia or New Zealand is much more expensive, so it gets back to the economics of beekeeping industry and how much they can afford to buy these overseas packages. They have other diseases. This is chalk brood. It's a fungus that affects the honeybees. It also affects leafcutter bees, a different closely related species. And it reduces the productivity of the colony. So if you have any disease, basically the productivity, the amount of honey production or the amount of brood, the population size of your colony will decrease.
You mentioned, sorry, about the importing from Australia. Is that like your whole colony, or is that just some seed stock you need or something?
So he's asking what exactly gets imported. That's a good question. So when I say a package of bees, it's literally like a package of bees. You get a box of bees in the mail, and in there'll be about 10 or 20,000 bees, a couple pounds worth of bees, and usually it comes with a queen, although sometimes you can buy the queen separately depending what you want to do. So commercial beekeepers will import, between hundreds and thousands of these packages in the early spring. They'll put them in a box like this, and then the bees will just take off and grow. So you can order queens individually. They're about $25 to $30 for just one queen bee. And one of these packages of bees is about, I think this year they were about $200 for a couple pounds of bees. $235, there you go.
And is that instead of overwintering, or is that just because you had an overwintering problem you needed to restock?
Depends. If you're trying to expand your beekeeping operation, you can either do what's called splitting, and you'll take a hive and literally just split it into a couple different hives, or you can start out with a package of bees. The packages we import tend to be really quite healthy and disease-free, otherwise we wouldn't be allowed to import them. But the problem is when you import livestock from an area that's disease-free, they tend to be more susceptible to those diseases. So they tend to come in quite healthy, but they tend to be more susceptible to things like mites, American foul brood, and chalk brood. And also you're purchasing queens that have evolved in New Zealand, which they argue has winter. I argue doesn't really have what I would consider winter in New Zealand, even the far south. And so they're not necessarily the best bee for our climate. So probably most of you have seen a honeybee colony. This is what it looks like. You've seen them in the fields. And inside are what we call frames of wax. So there's comb. This is all wax comb that the bees have built out. This is what they'd use as a honeybee frame. You can see it's nice and light wax. This is after the honey has been extracted. So they just scrape off the cover of each of these cells and they spin them around, and that gets the honey out. Brood frames look a lot darker, and you don't want to use those for honey production. They keep the brood production separate from the honey because nobody wants bee larvae in their honey. So that's what these are. These are just, you can see they're just boxes full of these combs. And as the colony grows and they start producing more honey, they just add another box on, and then they take it off to extract the honey. This is more what it looks like naturally. The bees tend to build their comb in, well, I have a better picture. Somewhere? Oh yeah. So naturally they build their nests, this species builds their nest inside a cavity, so it might be inside a a tree in nature, in the wild. And they're very organized. They tend to always have the brood in the middle because they want to keep the brood warm. So the bees always cover the brood, and they can actually keep it at 34 degrees Celsius, even all through a Canadian winter. This area, the center of the cluster, will always be above 30 Celsius. And then on the outside, that's where they store their food, because if it gets chilled a bit, it doesn't matter. And they're very neat and tidy, which we take advantage of when we go to extract the honey. The brood nest will be down here, and all the honey will be up here, and so we can keep it separate. So this is what a brood comb looks like. That's where they're rearing their larvae. And if you take a closer look, this is what it looks like inside. You know that song about picking up the baby bumblebee? Yeah, it's not so appealing once you know what a baby bee. No, you don't want to hear me sing, trust me. So the queen will lay an egg. It's just this tiny little white dot. You have to have pretty good eyes to see it. So she'll lay an egg in the bottom of the cell, 1 egg per cell. And then it develops into a larvae, and it's basically swimming in this pool of food, and it just sort of turns around, spins around and eats food. And then it turns into a larvae and stretches out and grows, and then it pupates. Once it starts pupating, they'll cover the cell up because they don't need to feed it anymore when it's pupating. And it basically turns from this little white grub into slowly, gradually, what we would recognize as an adult bee. And there's a couple different kinds of bees in a colony. We all are familiar with worker bees. These are the ones that do all the work. These are the ones you see out flying around. So they're the ones that gather the nectar, gather the water, gather the pollen, and bring it back. But we also have a queen, of course. She's easy to tell because she has a really enormous abdomen. And her abdomen is essentially all ovaries. She's just this egg-laying machine. And the workers just basically feed her constantly. And she just lays eggs constantly. She can lay up to 2,000 eggs in a single day.
I mean, the workers are all males then?
Workers are all females as well.
Oh,
Only the females can sting because a stinger is a modified ovipositor, so the part of the bee that lays eggs. So only females can sting. And the males, which are drones, we call them drones, they don't sting. They basically don't do anything except reproduce. So they're really funny. They remind me of my brother, actually, because you see them sort of, they stagger out of the colony in the afternoon, and they sort of like, you know, teenage boys, they sort of like, it's bright, and I go, oh my goodness, the light, and they sort of like groom themselves up, and then they fly off to find a queen to mate with. That's what they do. And then the workers will usually kick them out in the fall because they don't want to feed them through the whole winter. Yeah. I'll let you just take your imaginations from there. When a honeybee colony grows too big for its boxes, they reproduce by what's called swarming. Some of you may have been lucky enough to see a swarm of bees. They're actually, people freak out, but they're actually really gentle because a swarm of bees has nothing to defend. They don't have a nest to defend. So they're actually very gentle. And it's what happens is the old queen will leave with the swarm because she's already pretty mature, ready to lay eggs. So she's a safe bet. So she leaves with the swarm, the scout bees will go and find a new nest, and then they can quickly build a lot of comb in the new nest and start rearing more brood and replace themselves fairly quickly. And in the old box, there'll be a queen cell, which looks like this. So this has a queen developing in it. It's much longer, and she has a very short development time compared to the other bees. So she'll be reared in the old nest, and then she'll go off and take a mating flight, which is risky for a bee because she could get eaten, she could get lost. And so they'll have a number of these going on at different stages. And then once she emerges, she'll kill any competition, and she'll try and be the only queen. And then hopefully she'll come back mated, and then she'll never leave the colony again unless she swarms later. What else? Oh, I know what I was going to show you. Pollen. So people think of agriculture as a monoculture. They see big fields of canola, and they don't realize exactly how much stuff is out there. These are all pollen samples that we took from, let's see if I can show them. We took them from honeybee colonies that were situated on a canola field. And these were just the dominant pollen colors. But we almost never find pollen coming into a colony that's exclusively canola. It's always got significant amounts of other stuff. This is a very important bee crop. First wildflower of the year. Dandelions. This is very important for bees. It's bright orange pollen, so it's easy to identify, but dandelions, willows, some of the trees, those are really important first forage crops for bees. Canola pollen, obviously, they're starting to pick up a lot of that. By mid-bloom, it'll be, most colonies will bringing in mostly canola. And then we get other things like lentils, and I'm not even sure what these two are.
Well, I take pollen off of grass. I had some sheep fescue in a shelter belt. It was flowering. And
Bees? Yeah.
Bees all over it.
Bees will take pollen off of almost anything, including grasses, including corn, which doesn't even have nectar. I've had bees near a coal dock, and they picked up coal and packed it in their cells. They'll pick up sawdust, there's a famous case in France where they were foraging at an M&M factory.
Oh, yeah.
Some of you might have seen that. And that's a problem for beekeepers because legally that's not honey. It's not the right color and it's not derived from a plant source. So they can't sell that as honey. It's contaminated. So it is a problem. Yeah, you don't want your bees packing coal and feeding it to their brood. So yeah, it is a problem. But for the most part, they tend to stick to plants. And for the most part, they like plants that are attractive. They tend to like yellow and blue, and red flowers tend to be pollinated by things like hummingbirds. Bumblebees really like the blue, purple flowers. Flies tend to like the white flowers, but it's all generalizations.
What's the consequence of them bringing in the pollen that doesn't have the nectar?
Nothing, so what happens is pollen is their protein source, and so that's what they feed to the developing, well, they change it in their guts, but that's what they feed to the developing brood is the pollen, and the nectar is their carbohydrate source. So it's separated. They need both, but they tend to like plants that have both because they can get both from one place. That's the only thing. So they will forage on things like corn and grasses, even though they're not that attractive. But if they have a high pollen need because they have lots of brood, then they'll go to those because they can get the protein that they need. That's why canola is actually a pretty good plant for bees, because it not only does it have abundant flowers with both pollen and nectar, but the pollen actually has all the 9 essential amino acids that bees need to complete their development. So dandelion, for example, is missing 2 of them. So if you feed bees exclusively dandelion pollen, they can't rear brood from it. But there's always a little bit of something mixed in with it. So they can make do because they have access to multiple types of forage. Any other questions?
You mentioned the impact of, say, varroa mites and some of the chalkroot foul brood. Anything else that is threatening bees?
Is this a leading question?
Sure.
I'm sure you've all heard about bees. They've been in the news a lot because of neonicotinoid insecticides, and there have been a lot of problems with it. There was some in Europe, particularly Germany I'm thinking of, but also Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba have had incidences of poisoning of bees by neonicotinoid insecticides. Where we tend to have problems with it in Canada is particularly with corn planting, because there's a dust that's generated and that dust contains the insecticide. And so if, like I just said, bees will collect anything. That includes insecticide-laden dust, or they fly through it when it's in the air. And it's an insecticide, and it wouldn't be a good one if it didn't kill insects. Here in Alberta, we have done analyses. The federal and provincial government together have done a project looking at the amounts of residues in canola pollen. We find pretty low levels on the order of about 0.2 to 2 micrograms per kilogram. So it's really low. It's definitely below the toxic threshold for honeybees. It's been a big problem in the research literature because it hasn't been easy to resolve what the field realistic doses do to bees. It seems like for honeybees, field realistic levels, particularly the levels we use here in Canada because they are higher other places, the levels we see in canola in Alberta don't seem to cause a problem for honeybees. Our honeybees are healthy, and even there was a recent Nature paper, for example, that showed they studied 3 types of bees: honeybees, mason bees, and leafcutter bees. For the honeybees, they had treated fields and control fields that weren't treated. And The honeybees, they saw no difference, whether it was a treated or a control field. There was no difference in the honeybee health or the size of the populations. The mason bees completely did not reproduce on the treated fields compared to the controls, which they did. And the leafcutter bees, or sorry, the bumblebees, it was bumblebees, showed reduced colony growth on the treated fields. So we absolutely cannot assume that all bees are going to react the same way to all pesticides. I mean, we're talking about organisms that are as diverse as a giraffe and a goat. And you're not going to feed a giraffe what you would feed a goat, because a goat can eat anything. And so we're starting to resolve it a little bit, but it's going to take time. The big question, I think, right now is, how does it affect these wild bees? Because that's a major concern. They seem to be more susceptible. The other thing with honeybees is if one bee dies, it doesn't matter, because you have all these 59,000 other bees ready to step in, and there's a lot of flexibility because they're omnivorous. They eat, in terms of flower choice, they eat a wide range of flowers, whereas some of the other solitary bees are more specialized and they'll only eat one thing. They also have this division of labor, so if say, for example, the foraging force dies one day, there's more bees ready to start foraging, so they have that flexibility that way. Whereas the solitary bees, if the mother bee dies or gets lost and doesn't return to her nest, that nest just completely fails. But they also have very different physiology, very different life cycles, so they're not going to react the same way to the same compound. Yeah?
Under ideal conditions, how quickly will a beehive double the numbers in the spring?
So colonies that were basically, if we took an overwinter colony, by the end of spring, it wouldn't fill one of these boxes. By mid-July, it would fill 4 in terms of adult bee population, or even more. They grow quite quickly, especially up in the Peace with the long days. They grow really, really quickly, but it just depends on the weather, like everything in agriculture.
What happens if DuPont, Pioneer, and Monsanto get their wish of 7 million acres of corn in Western Canada? Do we now have an issue?
That becomes almost a forage issue, because corn's not a really good crop for bees to forage on compared to something like canola. It doesn't have the nectar supply. Beekeepers don't like to put bees on corn because they don't get a honey crop off it. They don't get a pollination fee for it. So all of a sudden the beekeepers have a big problem. What are they going to put their bees on? In terms of neonicotinoid issues, it depends on the seeder. My understanding is we use different seeders out here in the West. I'm not a farmer, but my understanding is we have different seeders, and so they don't generate as much dust. But they're also working with fluidity agents to reduce the dust coming off the seeds. So hopefully that's a problem that they're in the process of fixing. Those specific isolated incidences of bee kills because of the dust. Any last questions about bees, honeybees, bumblebees? No? Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Shelley.
Thank you.